He stood too, feeling lighter somehow. "Thank you for listening to me." "Thank you for learning," she replied simply. As he walked back to the bus stop, he thought about how different his life was now from just a few months ago. His designer clothes were gathering dust in his closet. His social media accounts were full of posts about community service and educational inequality instead of luxury cars. Some of his old friends had drifted away, but he'd made new ones, people who challenged him to think differently, to be better. The watch that had started it all sat in its box on his shelf, a reminder of who he used to be. But now, when he looked at it, he didn't see a status symbol anymore. He saw a turning point, a moment when life had forced him to face his own prejudices and choose who he wanted to become. The bus arrived, and as he climbed aboard, he noticed one of the regular volunteers from the center. They nodded at each other in recognition, and he took a seat nearby. They started talking about the upcoming fundraiser for the scholarship program, and he realized something. He felt more at home on this crowded bus, talking about making a difference, than he ever had in his mansion. The sun was setting as the bus moved through the city, casting long shadows across the streets. He thought about Mrs. Washington's words, "Thank you for learning." The journey wasn't over. He knew he still had a lot to learn, a lot to improve, but for the first time in his life, he was actually looking forward to the process of growth, to becoming someone worthy of respect, not because of his family's money, but because of his actions and character. After 3 months of volunteering at the community center, the young hare learned that Mrs. Washington had found a new job at a small family-owned bed and breakfast. His cousin, who kept in touch with her, mentioned that she seemed happy there. The owners appreciated her experience and had given her a position managing their entire housekeeping staff. He spent a week working up the courage to visit her. When he finally did, he chose to take the bus instead of having his driver take him. It was a small gesture, but it felt important somehow. He carried with him a letter he'd rewritten dozens of times, though he knew no words could really fix what he'd done. The bed and breakfast was a charming Victorian house, nothing like his family's modern mansion. When he walked in, he could already see Mrs. Washington's touch in the fresh flowers and the perfectly arranged furniture. A young worker at the front desk recognized his name when he asked for her. "She's in the garden," the worker said, pointing toward the back. "She's teaching the new staff about growing herbs for the kitchen." He found her kneeling by a herb garden, just like the day of their confrontation. But this time, everything was different. She looked up as he approached, her expression neutral but not unkind. "I thought you might come eventually," she said, standing up and brushing soil from her hands. "Your cousin keeps me updated about your work at the center." He clutched the letter in his hands, suddenly feeling very young and very foolish. "I wrote this for you," he said, holding it out. "But I'd like to say it in person too, if that's okay." She gestured to a nearby bench, and they sat down together. The garden smelled of lavender and mint, and somewhere nearby, birds were singing. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "I know those words aren't enough, but I need to say them. What I did was wrong. Not just the accusation, but everything. How I treated you, how I looked down on you, how I never bothered to see you as a person. I was spoiled, prejudiced, and cruel." Mrs. Washington listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. He continued, the words coming easier now. "At the community center, I met a woman who works 3 jobs, just like you did when you were putting your kids through school. She told me how her daughter just got accepted to law school, and all I could think about was how I never even asked about your children. I was too busy looking down on you to notice how much I could learn from you." A small smile appeared on Mrs. Washington's face. "My daughter mentions you sometimes," she said. "She's working at that law firm now, handling discrimination cases. Ironic, isn't it?" He felt his face flush, but he didn't look away. "I deserve that. I deserve a lot worse, actually. But I want you to know that I'm trying to change. Really change, not just saying sorry to make myself feel better." "I know," she replied. "The center director is an old friend of mine. She tells me you're there even on days you're not required to be." "I'm starting a program there," he said, sitting up straighter. "Using some of my trust fund money to create scholarships for kids who can't afford college. The coding genius who runs the computer lab? He's going to be our first recipient." Mrs. Washington nodded approvingly. "Using your privilege to help others, that's a good start." "It's not enough," he admitted, "but it's something." And he hesitated, then continued, I was hoping you might consider being on the scholarship committee. We need people who really understand the value of hard work and education. People like you. She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. You know, when I left your house, I was angry, she finally said, not just about the accusation, but about what it represented. But seeing you now, hearing about the changes you're making, that anger has turned into something else. Maybe hope. Does that mean you'll consider it? The scholarship committee? I'll think about it, she said, standing up. But right now, I have new staff to train. And from what I hear, you have a coding class to teach at the center. The man nodded slowly. You know, I've been coming to this center for 15 years. Seen a lot of rich kids come through here doing court-ordered community service. Most of them just wait it out. But you're actually trying to learn, aren't you? I am, he replied softly. I have to. Have to and want to are different things, the man said wisely. Figure out which one it is for you. That night, as he lay in his bed thinking about the man's words, he realized something important. He wasn't volunteering because he had to anymore. Somewhere along the way, it had become something he wanted to do. The center, with its mismatched furniture and warm atmosphere, felt more real than his pristine mansion ever had. For the first time in his life, the young hare's parents didn't try to fix things with money. Instead, his father walked into his room one morning with a different kind of solution. Get dressed, his father said, tossing him some plain clothes instead of his usual designer outfits. You're coming with me. They drove in silence, passing the fancy part of town and heading into a neighborhood he never visited. The buildings here weren't as shiny, the cars weren't as new, but there was life everywhere. Kids playing on the sidewalks, elderly couples tending to small gardens, people greeting each other by name as they passed. They pulled up to a community center. A worn but clean building with a small sign that read East Side Community Center, everyone welcome. His father turned off the engine but didn't get out. I made some calls, his father said, staring straight ahead. You're going to volunteer here 3 days a week. No excuses, no buying your way out. And you're going to attend their diversity and sensitivity workshops. But he started to protest. No buts, his father cut him off. For the first time in my life, I'm actually ashamed of how we raised you. That stops now. Inside the community center, he felt like a fish out of water. His expensive watch, the black one, he couldn't bring himself to wear the Rolex anymore, and designer shoes felt out of place. The center's director, a warm-faced woman in her 60s, didn't seem impressed by his family name. Everyone who comes through those doors is equal, she told him firmly. We're here to help each other, not judge each other. You'll start in the food distribution program. The first few days were rough. His hands weren't used to lifting heavy boxes of canned goods. He didn't know how to organize inventory or handle the simple cash register in the thrift store section. But slowly, something started to change. He met people who worked 3 jobs to support their families. He helped elderly residents carry their groceries and listened to their stories. He learned that the teenager who helped in the computer lab was a coding genius who couldn't afford college. Every day brought new lessons that no private school had ever taught him. The diversity workshop was even more eye-opening. The facilitator, a former corporate executive who now dedicated his life to teaching awareness, didn't sugarcoat anything. Privilege isn't about feeling guilty, he explained to the group. It's about recognizing your advantages and using them to help level the playing field for others. During one session, they did an exercise where everyone wrote down their daily worries. The young hare's list included things like social media drama and which car to drive. Then he read the lists of others, paying medical bills, finding safe childcare, dealing with workplace discrimination. It hit him hard. You're not a bad person for having advantages, the facilitator told him privately after seeing his troubled face. But you have a responsibility to be aware of them. At home, things were changing too. He started talking to the remaining staff differently. He learned their names, asked about their families, and actually listened to their answers. He found out that their chef had once owned a restaurant but lost it during a recession. The gardener was putting his son through medical school. Every person had a story he'd never bothered to hear before. One day, while helping sort donations at the center, he found a book of poetry. It was a one-copy, clearly well-loved, with notes in the margins. He started reading during his lunch breaks and discovered the power of words written by people whose lives were nothing like his. "You're different," his cousin remarked during one of her visits to the center where she volunteered as a medical consultant. "You actually look people in the eye now when they talk to you." But the real breakthrough came during a community dinner at the center. He was serving food when an elderly man approached the counter. The man's hands were rough from years of work, his clothes simple but clean. "You remind me of someone," the man said, studying his face. "Weren't you the kid from that social media post? About the housekeeper?" The young hare felt his face burn with shame, but he didn't look away. "Yes, sir, that was me." Looking out his window one afternoon, he saw Mrs. Washington teaching the junior housekeepers one last time. They gathered around her like students with a beloved teacher, taking notes as she explained her cleaning techniques. Even from a distance, he could see the respect in their eyes, the way they hum on her every word. He realized he'd never bothered to notice any of this before. His cousin stopped by again, this time not to rescue him, but to make him face reality. "You know what's ironic?" she said, sitting on the edge of his messy bed. "Mrs. Washington's daughter just passed the bar exam. She's going to be working at one of the top law firms in the city. The woman you accused of stealing your watch put her kids through college on a housekeeper's salary. But you never bothered to learn anything about her, did you?" The words stung because they were true. He'd never asked, never cared to know about the lives of the people who made his comfortable life possible. They had been nothing more than background characters in what he thought was his story. As the week drew to a close, Mrs. Washington packed up her supplies for the last time. The other staff members organized a small goodbye party in the kitchen, something they'd never done before. He watched from the doorway as they hugged her, some of them crying, all of them promising to stay in touch. Not one of them glanced his way. When she finally walked out the front door, carrying a box of her belongings, the mansion felt emptier than it ever had before. The young hare stood at his window, watching her car drive away, realizing that she had taken something intangible with her, something his family's money couldn't replace. She had taken the illusion that wealth made him better than others, and without that illusion, he was starting to see himself clearly for the first time. The next few days in the mansion felt like walking through thick fog. The usual bustling energy had been replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Where staff members once greeted the young hare with warm smiles, there were now just quick nods and averted eyes. The weight of his actions hung over the house like a heavy cloud. Mrs. Washington continued working, true to her word about finishing the week, but things were different. The special touches that had made the house feel like a home, fresh flowers in unexpected places, the smell of baked goods in the afternoon, little notes reminding him about his schedule, all of that had stopped. She did her job perfectly, but nothing more. The warmth was gone, replaced by a professional coldness that felt worse than anger. "Your breakfast is served in the dining room," she would say, instead of the usual, "I made your favorite pancakes today." The difference was subtle but cut deep. The other staff members had changed too. The chef, who used to joke with him about his picky eating habits, now just silently placed his meals and walked away. The gardener, who had always been happy to teach him about different plants, suddenly became too busy whenever he approached. It was like he'd become a ghost in his own home. But the real shock came when he opened his phone one morning. His cousin had posted about the incident on social media. She hadn't used names, but everyone in their circle knew exactly who she was talking about. The post read, "Watching someone falsely accuse a hardworking person of theft, only to realize they'd left their stolen item at my house. Privilege really blinds some people. Do better." The comments were brutal. Friends he'd known since elementary school were expressing their disappointment. Classmates were sharing similar stories about his behavior that he'd never thought twice about. Even his girlfriend texted to say she needed space to think about things. His parents, finally forced to face the situation, had their own way of dealing with it. His father, during a rare breakfast appearance, slid an envelope across the table. "What's this?" the young man asked, although he could guess from his father's stern expression. "Mrs. Washington's final paycheck, plus a very generous severance package," his father replied, stirring his coffee absently. She refused it. Said she couldn't accept money that felt like it was trying to buy her dignity. "Do you have any idea how many people have refused our money before, son?" "None, until now." His mother, usually skilled at smoothing over any social situation with a laugh and a wave of her hand, seemed at a loss. She'd tried to host her regular lunch with her socialite friends, but half of them had suddenly become busy after the story spread. The young man retreated to his room, but even there he couldn't escape. The usually spotless space now had a thin layer of dust. None of the other housekeepers wanted to clean his room. His expensive clothes lay scattered where he'd dropped them, his bed was unmade, and somehow it all felt right. This mess was a perfect reflection of how his life had become. But she held up a hand, polite but firm. "I've already made up my mind. I'll finish out the week to help you find a replacement, but after that, I'll be leaving." She picked up her herb basket and walked toward the kitchen, her head held high. The garden fell silent again, but this time it was a silence heavy with consequence. The morning sun continued to shine, indifferent to the drama it illuminated, while the young man stood rooted to the spot, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical thing. His cousin looked at him, shaking her head slowly. "You really messed up this time, didn't you? And you know what the worst part is? While you were out here throwing accusations, she was probably planning to make those herb scones you love so much. I saw the ingredients laid out in the kitchen when I walked in." Each word felt like a knife, cutting through the last remnants of his self-justification. The truth had emerged, but it wasn't just about a misplaced watch anymore. It was about something much deeper, something that would force him to take a hard look at himself and the person he had become. The black SUV's door opened, and out stepped his cousin, still wearing her medical scrubs from her night shift at the hospital. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene before her, the gathered staff, the tense atmosphere, her aunt and uncle in their robes, and her cousin looking like he was about to explode. "What's going on?" she asked, walking towards the group. "I just came to pick up my phone charger from last weekend's dinner, but it looks like I walked into something serious." "Your cousin is accusing Mrs. Washington of stealing his watch," his father explained, running a hand over his tired face. "The new Rolex." The cousin stopped in her tracks, her forehead wrinkling in confusion. Then understanding dawned on her face, followed quickly by disbelief. "Wait, are you talking about the rose gold watch?" "Yes," the young man snapped. "The one that's mysteriously gone missing after she cleaned my room." His cousin let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a groan. "Oh my God, you can't be serious. Your watch isn't missing. It's sitting on my coffee table. You left it at my place during the family dinner last Sunday. You took it off to show everyone how it glows in the dark, remember?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the fountain seemed to quiet down, as if holding its breath. That's not possible," he stammered, but the certainty in his voice was cracking. "I remember wearing it yesterday." "No, you didn't," his cousin said firmly. She pulled out her phone, quickly scrolling through her photos. "Look, I even took a picture when you left it, thinking I should text you about it, but then got called into an emergency shift." She held up her phone, showing a photo time-stamped from Sunday night, the watch sitting on her wooden coffee table right next to a half-empty glass of soda. The young man's face drained of color, but his cousin wasn't finished. "And if you need more proof," she continued, her voice taking on an edge, "check the security cameras. I bet they'll show you wearing a different watch yesterday. That black one you're always complaining is too plain." The head of security, who had been watching silently from the doorway, spoke up. "I can pull up yesterday's footage right now, sir." Everyone watched as the security chief tapped on his tablet. After a few moments, he turned it around to show crystal-clear footage from the previous morning. There was the young heir, walking through the mansion's halls, his left wrist clearly sporting a plain black watch. The weight of what he'd done crashed down on him like a tidal wave. He looked at Mrs. Washington, who stood there with quiet dignity, then at the other staff members who were avoiding his gaze, and finally at his parents, who looked both relieved and deeply embarrassed. I was so sure." His voice trailed off, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. His cousin walked over to Mrs. Washington. "I am so sorry you had to go through this," she said sincerely. "I've heard amazing things about your work from the hospital staff who known you. Some of their parents have been your clients for years." Mrs. Washington nodded gracefully, but her eyes held a sadness that went beyond this single incident. "Thank you, miss. But if you'll excuse me, I have something to say." She turned to face the young man's parents. I've worked in many homes over the years, but I've never been accused of theft before. I take pride in my work and my integrity. With all due respect, I don't think I can continue working in an environment where I'm not trusted." The young man felt his stomach drop. He opened his mouth to speak, but what could he possibly say? How do you take back an accusation that revealed so much about your own prejudices? His father stepped forward. "Mrs. Washington, please, we can discuss this." The tension in the garden was thick enough to cut with a knife. The morning birds had gone silent, as if they too were watching the drama unfold. The young man stood there, his silk pajamas now damp with sweat, his certainty starting to crack just slightly under Mrs. Washington's steady gaze. But before anyone could say another word, the power of a car engine broke the tension. A sleek black SUV pulled into the circular driveway, and someone stepped out, someone who was about to turn this whole situation on its head. The young man didn't notice the new arrival, though. He was too busy trying to hold on to his anger, trying to maintain his position of power. But with each passing second, that position was crumbling like a sandcastle facing the incoming tide. He had no idea that in just a few moments, everything would change, and the real price of his accusations would become crystal clear. The morning sunshine suddenly felt harsh and accusing as the young hare marched across the garden, his expensive slippers getting damp from the freshly watered grass. Mrs. Washington was still gathering herbs, her woven basket already half full with fragrant rosemary and thyme. The peaceful scene was about to shatter like fine crystal dropped on marble floors. "Where is it?" His voice came out louder than he'd intended, making several birds scatter from nearby bushes. "My watch. Where did you put it?" Mrs. Washington straightened up slowly, her hand still holding a sprig of basil. Her face remained calm, but something flickered in her eyes, not fear, but something that looked almost like disappointment. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, young sir," she replied, her voice steady and dignified. "Don't play dumb with me." He was practically shouting now. "You were cleaning my room yesterday, and now my Rolex is gone. It's worth more than you make in 5 years." By now, other staff members had started gathering at the windows and garden doors, drawn by the commotion. The young man's parents, still in their morning robes, appeared on the upper balcony, looking down at the unfolding scene with confused expressions. "Son, what's going on?" His father called down, but the young man barely heard him. "Empty your bag," he demanded, pointing at Mrs. Washington's personal handbag sitting on a nearby garden bench. "Empty it right now, or I'm calling the police." Mrs. Washington placed her herb basket carefully on the ground and stood up straight. She was shorter than him, but somehow she seemed to tower in that moment. "Young man," she said, her voice firm but quiet. "I've been working as a housekeeper for 27 years. I've cleaned homes for senators, doctors, and business owners. Not once has anyone accused me of theft, and I'm not about to let you start now." His father was making his way down to the garden now, tying his robe as he walked. "Son, this is a serious accusation. Are you sure about this?" "Of course I'm sure. The watch was there yesterday, and now it's gone. She was the only one in my room." His voice cracked slightly, a hint of childish frustration breaking through his anger. The head of housekeeping stepped forward, her hands clasped nervously. "Sir, Mrs. Washington has an impeccable record. Perhaps we should check the room again." "I've already checked everywhere." He ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "Just empty the bag. If you have nothing to hide, then prove it." His mother had joined them now, looking uncomfortable in her silk robe. "Darling, maybe we should all calm down and—" "No," he cut her off. "I want to see what's in that bag right now." He took a step toward Mrs. Washington's handbag. "Stop right there." Mrs. Washington's voice was like steel wrapped in velvet. "You were raised with every privilege, but right now you're acting like you were raised with no manners at all. I did not take your watch. I don't need to prove my innocence to you or anyone else." The young man felt his face growing hot. Other staff members were whispering now, and he could see the gardener shaking his head. Even the chef had come out of his kitchen, still holding a wooden spoon. "Do you know how much that watch costs?" he sputtered, his voice rising higher. "It's a limited edition." "I know exactly how much it costs," Mrs. Washington replied calmly. "And I know something else too. The price of a watch doesn't make you a better person than anyone else. Right now, you're not acting like someone who deserves such an expensive gift." His parents exchanged glances, a mix of embarrassment and uncertainty on their faces. They'd never had to handle a situation like this before. Usually, they just threw money at problems until they went away. As he pushed open the French doors leading to the garden, the morning air hit his face. It was cool and fresh, a stark contrast to the heat of his anger. Mrs. Washington looked up as he approached, her expression neutral as always. She had no idea that she was about to become the center of a storm that would change everything in the household. The young man took a deep breath, his fists clenched at his sides. In his mind, he was absolutely certain he knew what had happened to his watch. He didn't need proof, he had his suspicions, and in his world, there had always been enough. Little did he know that the next few minutes would set in motion events that would shake his privileged worldview to its very foundation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal far more about himself than any potential theft. As he opened his mouth to speak, the peaceful morning was about to shatter into pieces, much like the comfortable illusions he'd lived with all his life. It started like any other morning in the mansion. The early California sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted up from the kitchen. But something felt off as the young heir to the family fortune got ready for his day. He'd been planning to wear his favorite watch, a limited edition Rolex his father had given him for his birthday just 2 months ago. The watch wasn't just any timepiece, it was a statement, a symbol of everything his family represented. The subtle gleam of its rose gold case, the way it caught the light just right, how it made other kids at school stare in envy, he loved everything about it. But when he reached for the watch in its usual spot on his dresser, his hand found empty space. At first, he thought he was just groggy from sleep. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The spot where the watch should have been sitting was bare, nothing but a faint circle of dust marking where it had rested. "Hey," he called out, his voice echoing through the massive bedroom. "Has anyone been in here?" The head of housekeeping appeared at his door, her clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Washington cleaned your room yesterday evening, sir. Is something wrong?" His mind immediately started racing. Mrs. Washington, the new housekeeper who didn't bow to his every whim, who looked at him with those steady eyes that seemed to see right through his privileged facade. She had been in his room, and now his watch was gone. In his mind, it wasn't a coincidence. He started tearing through his room, pulling open drawers, tossing aside expensive clothes, and checking every surface. The more he searched, the more his anger grew. The watch had cost more than most people made in a year. How dare someone take it? How dare they think they could steal from him? His hands were shaking as he picked up his phone. He scrolled through his recent photos, finding one from 2 days ago where he was wearing the watch at dinner. It had definitely been here. He remembered taking it off before bed last night, or was it the night before? The days tended to blur together when you didn't have to worry about schedules or responsibilities. The house was starting to wake up properly now. He could hear the distant sound of vacuum cleaners, the clinking of dishes being prepared for breakfast, the soft murmur of staff going about their morning duties. Somewhere in this massive house, he thought, someone was probably admiring his watch, thinking they'd gotten away with it. His mind started creating scenarios, each one feeding his growing sense of outrage. The watch would be sold, he imagined, probably to some shady dealer who wouldn't ask questions about where it came from. The money would be enough to change someone's life, someone who hadn't grown up with everything handed to them on a silver platter. He stormed down to the kitchen, his silk pajamas rustling with each angry step. The staff members he passed quickly moved out of his way, recognizing the thunderous expression on his face, but he barely noticed them. His eyes were scanning for one person in particular. Through the window, he spotted Mrs. Washington in the garden, collecting fresh herbs for the chef's morning preparations. She moved with that same self-assured grace that had always irritated him, completely unaware that she was about to become the target of his suspicions. His heart was pounding now, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He'd never had to confront anyone before. People usually just gave him what he wanted. But this was different. This was about more than just a watch. This was about someone thinking they could take advantage of his family's generosity. Life in Beverly Hills had a way of making everything seem possible. At least, that's how it felt for the 17-year-old who lived in the massive white mansion on Ocean Drive. The house stood out even among its luxurious neighbors, with its perfectly manicured lawns, a fountain that danced with lights at night, and windows that sparkled like diamonds in the California sun. The young man who called this place home had never heard the word no in his life. His mornings began with freshly pressed clothes laid out by the staff, breakfast made to his exact preferences, and a luxury car waiting to drive him to his private school. He'd grown up watching his parents throw around $100 bills like they were pocket change, hosting parties where celebrities mingled with business tycoons, and treating expensive restaurants like their personal kitchen. Money wasn't just something they had, it was who they were. His father, a real estate mogul, spent more time in board meetings than at home, making deals that appeared in business magazines. His mother divided her time between charity galas and spa retreats, her way of dealing with the loneliness of an empty house. They covered their absence with unlimited credit cards and expensive gifts. Last Christmas, he got 3 cars, one for each garage bay, even though he had just gotten his license. The house staff moved like shadows through the mansion, trained to be invisible until needed. The gardener knew exactly how to trim the hedges into perfect shapes, the chef memorized everyone's dietary preferences, and the cleaning staff kept every surface spotless. They all knew the unwritten rule, keep the young master happy, no matter what. But things started to feel different when Mrs. Washington joined the household staff. She was different from the others, carrying herself with quiet confidence as she went about her work. While other staff members would scramble at his every whim, she simply nodded professionally and said, "I'll get to that when I finish my current task." It wasn't disrespect, it was dignity. This bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He wasn't used to people treating him like a normal person. When he dropped his towels on the bathroom floor, she'd remind him about the hamper instead of rushing to pick them up. If he left dishes scattered around his room, she'd point out that the kitchen staff would be happy to take them if he brought them downstairs. One particular morning, as he lounged by the pool scrolling through his phone, he overheard Mrs. Washington talking to another staff member about her daughter's college graduation. Something about her tone made him look up. She spoke with such pride about her daughter becoming a lawyer, about working extra shifts to help pay for law school, about the value of hard work and education. For a brief moment, he felt a strange feeling in his stomach. It wasn't the usual irritation he felt when staff members talked too loudly. It was something else, maybe curiosity, maybe even a hint of respect. But he quickly pushed it aside, returning to his phone and his familiar world of social media likes and luxury car photos. Little did he know that his comfortable world was about to be shaken to its core. The next day would bring an incident that would force him to question everything he thought he knew about himself, about others, and about the true meaning of privilege. But for now, he remained in his bubble, a king in his castle, completely unaware that the biggest challenge to his reign would come from within himself. The sun continued to shine on the pristine mansion, the fountain kept dancing, and the staff went about their duties. Everything seemed perfect on the surface, but beneath that polished exterior, something was about to crack. The young man's world was built on a foundation of privilege and prejudice, and it would take just one missing watch to make everything come crumbling down.